Welcome to the Managing Console and Delegating Authority lesson. Solucel's Help Desk is extending operations by opening a new facility. For some of the new staff, the SEP team is adding access to the Semantic Endpoint Protection infrastructure. In this lesson, you follow Solucel as they assign rights to multiple administrator types. You also learn how to manage administrator accounts and configure directory server authentication for an administrator account. The lesson objectives are shown in the slide. This is the Creating Administrator Accounts topic. The Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager is installed with one administrator account. You can delegate responsibility by adding accounts to install client software, change policy settings, manage groups, or run reports. Use administrator accounts to manage semantic endpoint protection features. When adding administrators, there are three account types. System Administrator provides access to all features. When logged on as a System Administrator, you manage all domains and sites. You can also create and manage all other accounts. System Administrators manage the databases and management servers for all sites. Administrator is also known as a Domain Administrator. When using an administrator account, you manage a single domain, including administrator and limited administrator accounts within that domain. You also manage the password rights for limited administrator and other administrators who have equal or less restrictive access rights. If authorized, the administrator fully manages a site through site rights. However, administrators cannot modify their own site rights. For limited administrators, rights must be explicitly granted. You give limited administrators full access, no access, or read-only access to site functionality, such as reporting or management tasks for specific client groups. You can add an administrator account on the Admin page. On the General tab of the Add Administrator dialog box, type the username and email address. The SEPM sends a message for password resets, so the email address must be accurate. You learn more about resetting passwords in the Managing Administrator Accounts topic. On the Access Rights tab, choose the account type and authorization for the tasks that the administrator performs in the environment. In this example, the configured account is a limited administrator with reporting rights. When setting up a limited administrator, select specific access rights. It is even possible to restrict the access to specific groups. Note: Manage Groups can restrict group access to full, read-only, or none. On the Authentication tab, you can set the following types of authentication. With Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager Authentication, you manage authentication in the SEPM. The password is specific to the Semantic Endpoint Protection product and is completely separate from user accounts controlled by the operating system or LDAP security methods. You can also set the password expiration date here. More information on SEPM authentication is covered in the Managing Administrator Accounts topic. You can also link the administrator to a directory account using directory authentication. You must specify an LDAP server or a Microsoft Active Directory server and the administrator's account name. You learn about directory authentication in the Configuring Directory Server Authentication for an Administrator Account topic. You can also choose to authenticate using RSA Secure ID mechanisms, including tokens, cards, and keypad cards. If your organization uses RSA Secure ID, use the following process to authenticate SEPM administrators. Install an RSA Authentication Manager server if necessary. As of version 12.1.6 MP5 and later, use RSA Authentication Manager 8.1. Deploy and configure the RSA Authentication Agent on the SEPM to connect to the RSA server. As of version 12.1.6 MP5 and later, use RSA Authentication Agent 7. Verify that the server registers as a valid host on the RSA Authentication Manager server. For versions of Authentication Manager earlier than 8.1, create the node secret file for the same host. Also ensure that the sdconf.rec file on the RSA Authentication Manager server is accessible on the network. Assign a synchronized Secure ID card or key fob to a management server account and activate the login name on the RSA Authentication Manager server. Ensure that the administrator has the RSA PIN or password available. Solucell can choose the type of account that they need based on roles and access rights. For example, an operations engineer who maintains servers, databases, and installs patches. Since Solucell has a single domain, the operations engineer could be a system administrator who is fully authorized to manage SEPMs in multiple regions. Anthony can assign a subset of tasks to a single team member, such as managing the virus and spyware protection and live update policies. The team member would likely be a limited administrator. If the employee is in charge of the desktop environment, Anthony could provide administrator access. In this type of role, the administrator would manage client groups and limited administrator accounts. Another type of limited administrator would be a help desk team member who creates reports and has read-only access to the policies. This slide shows an example of creating a limited administrator with policy rights who manages specific semantic endpoint protection policies. The administrator requires group rights to be enabled before applying policies to the specified groups. This slide shows the console view when a limited administrator with policy rights logs on. The limited administrator has full access to scan templates and management server lists. This slide shows an example of creating a limited administrator with policy rights who creates reports and has read-only access to policies. The administrator requires that view reports and manage groups are enabled with group rights set to read-only. Also select Manage Policies and enable Do Not Allow Editing of Shared Policies. This slide shows the console view when a limited administrator with read-only report and policy rights logs on. The limited administrator has read-only access to policies and policy components. The groups also display as read-only, so the limited administrator can view reports. This is the Managing Administrator Accounts topic. There are several types of tasks to consider when managing administrator accounts. Tasks include changing lockout settings, changing or resetting passwords, and configuring logon options. By default, the Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager locks out an administrator after a user tries to log on using an incorrect password too many times. You can configure these settings to increase the number of tries, or time the administrator is locked out, or turn off the feature. A locked account can be unlocked in the console by a full administrator in that domain or a system administrator. Managing accounts include changing passwords and allowing other administrators to reset passwords. You can also choose logon options for each type of administrator. You specify lockout settings in the General tab of the Administrator Properties. To prevent unauthorized access, enable the Lock an account after a certain amount of unsuccessful logon attempts option. Then choose the number of minutes the account remains locked. Once this period has passed, the account is available for one more try. If the wrong password is entered, the account locks again for the specified period. This cycle continues until the correct password is entered, at which point the logon attempt counter resets. You can also choose to send an email alert to the administrator when an account is locked. Note, the administrator needs to have a valid email address to receive alerts that the account is locked. For accounts using Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager authentication, change the password in the Authentication tab of the Administrator Properties. Type your password and the administrator's new password. Review the KB on the slide for allowed length and characters for username and passwords. Solucell uses the following considerations when changing passwords. System administrators can change the password for all administrators. Since Anthony manages Solucell's security infrastructure, he is a system administrator and can change passwords for any employee who access the Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager. Domain administrators can change the password for other domain administrators and limited administrators within the same domain. A domain administrator could be someone on a different team that needs access, such as an operations engineer or someone in charge of desktops. Anthony may not always have the bandwidth to do a password change, so this gives him the ability to delegate duties. Limited administrators can only change their own passwords. An example of a limited administrator would be someone who is assigned a specific set of duties, such as managing antivirus policies or generating reports. To reset a lost password, ensure the following items are enabled. Display the Forget Your Password link so that administrators can reset lost passwords. Then configure the mail server so that the mail server sends the notification. Note: this method is used for administrator accounts using Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager authentication. This does not apply to RSA Secure ID or directory server authentication. To display the Forget Your Password link, open Local Site Properties. Click the Passwords tab and enable the Allow Administrators to Reset the Passwords option. Note, the default settings have the option enabled, but you can disable it if you prefer to have a dedicated administrator manually reset passwords. In Step 2, click on the Email Server tab of Server Properties and fill out the email server settings so the SEPM can use your mail server. Information includes the server address, port number, and user credentials for an account on the mail server. After filling out the email server settings, send a test email to verify that the SEPM is ready to send the notification. From the Start menu, launch the Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager. In the Logon screen, click Forget Your Password in the Forget Password dialog box. Type the username and click Temporary Password. Check your email for a message to reset your password. Click the link to activate a temporary password. You change the temporary password immediately after logon. You can configure the following logon options for an administrator. Display a message for administrators to read before they log on to the console. The primary purpose is to show a legal notice notifying administrators that they are logging on to a proprietary computer. Allow or block access to the management console. The default settings are to grant access to all consoles, but you can secure a management console from remote connections by denying access to certain computers. Change how long an administrator can stay logged on to the management server. Protect the console by having the administrator re-enter the username and password after a given period. To display a message for administrators to review before logging on, open Domain Properties. Click the Logon Banner tab and enable the Provide a Legal Notice to Administrators when they log on to the Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager option. Then specify the Logon banner. Note, the message appears when the administrator types in their credentials during logon. After reading the message, they can acknowledge the notice and click OK. Solucell grants access to system administrators, IT administrators, and lab computers, such as a computer that is used for testing. Solucell denies access to anyone on the Internet and limited administrators who use consoles on a different network other than the network they manage. To allow or block logon access to the console, open Server Properties. On the General tab, review the Server Communication Permissions section. The default settings are to grant access to all consoles and servers, but you can change the radio button to Denied Access and choose computers for Except Those in the List Below section. To exclude, click Add and specify a single computer or group of computers. When specifying a single computer, you enter the IP address. When specifying a group of computers, you enter the IP address and subnet mask. To change how long an administrator can stay logged on to the management server, open Site Properties. On the General tab, click the Console Timeout drop-down list and select one of the available options for length of time. Increase security by decreasing the timeout period before logging back onto the management console. Administrators can also be allowed to use non-expiring passwords and save credentials in a browser. Settings can be enabled in the Domain Properties under the Passwords tab. Note, Static credentials can be used for a service account of least privilege. Service accounts are used for integrating with Active Directory and other third-party applications. This is the Configuring Directory Server Authentication for an Administrator Account topic. To set up a SEP14 Administrator account to use Active Directory authentication, you add an Active Directory server to the SEP14. After adding an Active Directory server, you create or modify an administrator account to use directory authentication. To complete the process, test the account by having the user log into SEP14 using the linked Active Directory password. Enter a name to identify your Active Directory server. Choose Active Directory for the server type. For the server, enter the IP address or host name of the Active Directory server. Enter a static Active Directory credential or service account of least privilege so the SEP14 can communicate with the Active Directory server. Click OK to save the changes. If a site uses a replicated Active Directory server, you can connect the Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager to both the primary directory server and the replicated server. If the primary directory server gets disconnected, the management server stays connected to the replicated directory server. The Semantic Endpoint Protection Manager can then authenticate administrator accounts on all Active Directory servers of the local site and replicated sites. For more information, see the KB listed on the slide. Edit an existing administrator account by opening the Administrator Properties and clicking the Authentication tab. Select Directory Authentication, and then for Directory Server, select the Active Directory server configured in the Server Properties. In Account Name, enter the account name as it appears in Active Directory. Click Check Account, and you see Directory Account Authenticated. Click OK, and then enter the password for the SEP14 Administrator account currently logged in to confirm the changes. To test the updated account settings, log onto the SEP14 using the Active Directory password for the Active Directory account specified. By logging onto the SEP14, it confirms the administrator account is configured to use directory authentication. This slide summarizes the lesson. For more information about the topics discussed in this lesson, refer to the resources listed on the slide, and remember to frequently check the Semantic Support website.